The phone rang just as the kettle began to whistle. It was late, far too late for anyone to be calling, except her. I didn't need to check the screen. My chest tightened before I even reached for the receiver. "I'll come for the money tonight, don't you dare go out." Her voice was clipped sharp and merciless, as though she were reading a line she had rehearsed too many times. My daughter Dahlia. She hung up before I could say anything in return. There was no space left for my voice in these conversations. I stood still, the whistle from the kettle screaming in the background, and realized my hand was trembling. This ritual had repeated itself for years, every month after the pension arrived. Yet each time the dread felt new, like a wound that refused to scar. I turned off the stove and sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the familiar ache in my chest, pulsing harder than usual. For a long time, I just listened to the refrigerator hum and the faint rush of cars on the street outside. I tried to remind myself to breathe, to gather strength for what was coming. My plan was simple. Leave the envelope on the table, as always, let her take it. Endure her scorn and wait for the silence that followed. But when I rose and walked to the drawer where I had tucked the envelope that morning, my breath caught in my throat. The drawer was empty. The neatly folded napkins were there, the old pen that no longer worked, but not the money. I pulled everything out one by one, refusing to believe it. I checked the cupboard above the sink, then the shoebox in my closet, though I knew I hadn't placed it there. The pension was gone. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. Only 2 people had keys to this apartment, me and Dahlia. My mind stumbled over the truth, unwilling to say it, but it pressed in anyway. She had already been here. She had let herself in while I was out buying groceries, or maybe while I slept. She had taken the money long before the call. The phone still sat on the table where I had dropped it. I looked at it as if it could give me answers. Why call to threaten me if she already had what she wanted? A chill crawled up my arms. Maybe this was no longer about money alone. I sat back down and pressed my palms together, the way I used to when my husband was alive, and we prayed over supper. Walter had been gone nearly 12 years, and in his absence, I had built a shell around myself, a quiet world of routine morning walks, church on Sunday's letters, to my cousin upstate. But all of it was overshadowed each month by Dahlia's demands, her footsteps, heavy in the hallway, her eyes stripped of softness. I remembered her as a little girl in a yellow dress, hair tangled from playing in the yard, hands sticky from lemonade. She used to press wildflowers into my palms and say, "For you, Mama." How did that girl grow into a woman who now broke into my home to rob me? The clock ticked past midnight, and I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. The kettle had gone cold. I poured the water into the sink and watched the steam curl upward. My body was weary, but sleep was impossible. Dahlia would arrive soon, expecting to find me waiting with an envelope that no longer existed. I didn't know how to face her empty-handed. I didn't know what words would come or if any words could reach her anymore. All I knew was that when the knock came, I would not only be confronting my daughter, I would be confronting the truth I had avoided for too long. And as I stared at the bare table in front of me, I realized that silence had already cost me more than I could bear. The table in front of me was bare, and the empty drawer felt like an open wound. But this wasn't the first time I had felt stripped of control. It had been happening little by little for years. I can still remember the first call. Dahlia had just turned 38, and I was newly widowed. The pension had begun to come regularly, a modest cushion after Walter's death. She rang me the very day it arrived. Her voice had been tight, almost desperate. "Just half, Mama. Just until I get back on my feet." I didn't question it. She was my daughter, flesh of my flesh. I told myself she was struggling, that she needed me. I told myself Walter would have wanted me to help. That night, I placed the envelope by the door, and she came to collect it, without even stepping inside. No hug, no thank you. Only the sound of the latch clicking as she left. It should have ended there, but it didn't. Every month after the call came again. Sometimes she dressed it up in excuses, bills to pay, rent behind, groceries to buy, but other times she didn't bother. Just half. Tonight. And I obeyed, as if her command carried the weight of law. I remember once in the middle of summer when the air conditioner had broken and the heat pressed down like a heavy quilt. I thought maybe I could keep the full amount and get the repairman to fix it. I rehearsed the words all day, Dahlia. I need the money for myself this time. But when the phone rang, my courage dissolved. The silence that followed her sharp demand was worse than anger. It was a void I couldn't bear. So I gave in again and spent the rest of the month with a box fan humming at my bedside, sweat soaking the sheets. Over time, I told myself stories to make it bearable. At least she visits me. At least I hear her voice. At least I am not forgotten. I clung to those scraps as though they were proof of love. Yet even as I whispered those lies to myself, I knew better. The visits were not about me. They were about the envelope. If ever I tried to speak of anything else, she grew restless, tapping her nails on the table, checking her phone. The little girl who once spent hours cutting colored paper into crooked hearts for my birthday seemed buried under layers of bitterness and want. I still keep one of those cards tucked in the drawer of my nightstand. On the front, drawn in shaky crayon, is a cake with too many candles, the wax dripping like tears. Inside, in her uneven letters, to Mama, the best in the world. I love you. When I hold it, I almost believe it was real, that there was a time when she saw me as something other than a wallet with a heartbeat. But the memory collides with the sound of her grown woman's voice, flat and demanding, slicing through the years like a knife. I've spent so long convincing myself that keeping quiet was the safest choice, that if I gave enough she would take what she wanted and leave me in peace. But silence has a way of expanding, filling every corner until there is no room left for dignity. It settles into your bones, makes you shrink inside your own skin. The kettle on the stove clicked as it cooled, a soft reminder of how long I had been sitting in the dark, replaying the past. Dahlia would be coming soon, expecting to find me waiting, obedient as always. Only this time, there was nothing to give. The envelope was gone, stolen before her words even reached me. How long can silence protect me before it finally destroys me? The hallway light flickered when I stepped out the next morning to collect the mail. My legs felt heavy, as though the night had stolen something from me that no amount of sleep could restore. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the envelopes before I even reached my door again. Marcella. I turned. Elias was standing across the hall, a worn flannel shirt tucked loosely into faded jeans. He leaned on the doorframe of his apartment, eyes sharp beneath a mess of white hair. I forced a smile, though my lips trembled. "Morning," I said, pretending to shuffle the letters as if they contained important news. "You look pale," he remarked gently. "Everything all right?" I nodded too quickly. "Just a rough night." Elias had lived across from me for nearly 15 years, ever since his wife passed. A retired carpenter, he filled his days repairing birdhouses and rocking chairs for neighbors who asked nicely. He had always been kind, but not intrusive. Someone who tipped his cap in greeting, carried groceries when my arms were full. That morning, however, his gaze lingered longer than usual. He disappeared into his apartment and returned a few minutes later with a small pot wrapped in a towel. "Soup," he said, pressing it into my hands. "Chicken and barley. You look like you could use it." I hesitated, the warmth of the pot seeping into my palms almost enough to steady the tremor. "You didn't have to." "I know," he replied simply. Back inside my apartment, I ladled the soup into a bowl. The smell was comforting, earthy, and familiar. Still, my stomach twisted as if refusing kindness, as if it had forgotten what it meant to receive something without strings attached. Later that afternoon, Elias knocked on my door. "Mind if I borrow your newspaper?" he asked. I handed it to him and he caught sight of my wrist as I reached out. The sleeve of my cardigan slipped just enough to reveal a faint yellow bruise blooming across my skin. His eyes narrowed, though his voice stayed calm. "That looks sore." I jerked my hand back and tugged the sleeve down. "Clumsy me," I muttered, forcing a laugh. Caught it on the cupboard handle. Elias didn't argue, but his silence weighed heavier than any words. He studied me for another moment, then nodded slowly and stepped back. "If you ever need anything," he said, "you know where I am." I closed the door quickly, leaning against it with my breath caught in my throat. The bruise pulsed, as if it knew it had betrayed me. I told myself he couldn't possibly guess the truth. People don't imagine a daughter hurting her own mother. It doesn't fit into the tidy boxes we keep in our heads about family. Yet the way Elias had looked at me told me he suspected something perhaps more than I wanted him to. I carried the bowl of soup back to the table and set it down, untouched. My reflection in the spoon's curve looked ghostly, almost unfamiliar. The house was quiet, except for the clock ticking steadily on the wall. Every sound seemed to echo louder, now the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint rustle of wind against the windows. Elias's words repeated in my mind, "You know where I am." A simple offer, but it stirred something uneasy inside me. Because if he did find out the truth, if he pieced together what I was too afraid to say, then my silence would no longer be enough to hide behind. What will Elias do if he discovers the truth I cannot admit? The morning began with a heaviness in my chest, as though a stone had been set there during the night. I tried to shake it off with a cup of coffee, but halfway through pouring the water, my hands trembled so badly that the mug slipped crashing to the floor in a burst of porcelain shards. The sound echoed through the apartment, and for a moment I stood, frozen, staring at the pieces scattered across the tile. Then the pain sharpened. It spread from beneath my ribs upward, a steady pressure that stole my breath. I gripped the counter for balance, but the room tilted the window, sliding sideways in my vision. I reached for the phone, with fingers that no longer seemed mine. The numbers blurred, but somehow I managed to punch 3911. The operator's voice was crisp, practiced, almost too calm. I stammered something about pain chest, can't breathe. She told me to stay on the line to unlock my door if I could. By the time the paramedics arrived, sweat had dampened my nightgown, and every breath rasped as if I were dragging air through a straw. They worked quickly, lifting me onto a stretcher, strapping wires to my chest. I caught glimpses of ceiling lights sliding above me as they wheeled me out Elias's door, cracking open just long enough for me to see his startled face. I wanted to tell him not to worry, but the words caught in my throat. At the hospital, the world became a blur of antiseptic smell, beeping monitors, and the steady hiss of oxygen. I drifted in and out, sometimes aware of hands adjusting tubes, other times floating in a haze where sound and light were distant, muffled things. When I opened my eyes fully, a woman in a white coat stood beside me. She was tall, her dark hair pulled back her expression, steady but not unkind. A tag on her coat read, "Dr. Karina Holt. You had a mild heart attack, Mrs. Rowan." She said my married name won. I still wasn't used to hearing after all these years. "You're stable now, but I want to ask you about something else." Her eyes flicked toward my arms. I followed her gaze. In the fluorescent light, the faint bruises I had tried so hard to hide looked darker, stark against my pale skin. "Did someone hurt you?" she asked softly. The question cut through me more sharply than the chest pain. My first instinct was to shake my head, to explain it away with the cupboard door, the clumsy fall. My throat tightened, and I found myself turning my face toward the wall, away from her eyes. Dr. Holt didn't push, not yet. She made a note on her clipboard and said quietly, "I'll have someone come by to talk with you." Then she left her footsteps fading down the corridor. Not long after, a different woman entered the room. Younger, maybe mid-30s, her auburn hair pulled neatly into a bun, a folder clutched to her chest. She introduced herself with a clear, calm voice. "My name is Nora Delacroix. I'm a hospital social worker. I help patients who might need support beyond medical care." She sat in the chair by my bed, not too close, not too far. Her eyes were steady, not probing, but patient, like someone willing to wait all day if necessary. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," she said. "But I want you to know whatever is happening, you are not alone in it." The hum of the oxygen filled the silence between us. I stared at my hands resting on the blanket, the bruises stark even there, the truth pressed against the back of my throat, desperate and dangerous. But fear rose higher, choking me, warning me of what might come if I dared to speak. Will I dare to tell them what really happened, or will fear choke me again? That night, after the nurses dimmed the lights, I realized I was no longer alone. When they wheeled another bed into the room, I turned my head just enough to see her, a woman with white hair neatly coiled into a bun, glasses perched on her nose, and a canvas tote bag tucked under her arm, as though even in sickness she had things to carry. "Evening," she said softly, her voice smooth, deliberate. I nodded, still too weary to speak. Later, when the ward quieted and the distant hum of monitors filled the air, I found her watching me. Her eyes were sharp, not unkind, but steady, like someone who had read too many books and now read people just as easily. "I'm Eveline Moreau," she said at last, her voice carrying the crisp authority of a teacher. "Retired. Literature. Marcella Rowan." I replied, my voice hoarse from disuse. She studied me for a moment, then reached for the lamp at her bedside and turned it down further. "Hospitals make it hard to sleep. Too much light. Too much noise." I nodded again, grateful for the dimness. For a long while, we stayed in silence, but it wasn't heavy. It felt like she had chosen not to rush me, as though she knew I had words, but no safe place to put them. When dawn light filtered weakly through the blinds, Eveline broke the quiet. "You carry something heavy," she said, not as a question, but a statement. I stiffened, unsure whether to answer. She leaned back against her pillow, her hands folded neatly over the blanket. "My son pushed me once," she said. Her tone didn't waver. Only once. But that was enough to end trust forever. Her words landed like a stone in still water rippling through me. I turned to look at her, searching for shame, for hesitation, but found none. She spoke the sentence as if it were simply fact, like stating her age or the color of the sky. I had never heard someone name it so plainly, without excuses, without trembling. The word violence hung in the room raw and unvarnished. Eveline caught my gaze. "I don't tell you this for sympathy. I tell you because silence is its own cage. I lived in it too long. I won't again." I wanted to ask how she had done it, how she had found the courage to give voice to what most people would rather bury. Instead, I stared at the bruises blooming on my arms, the ones Dr. Holt had noticed, the ones I still pretended away. A memory flashed Dahlia at 8 years old, coloring furiously at the kitchen table tongue between her teeth in concentration. She had drawn me taller than the house, a smiling sun overhead. She had pushed the picture into my hands with pride, saying, "See, Mama, you're strong." But the woman she had become no longer saw me as strong. She saw me as small, pliable, and silent. Eveline's voice pulled me back. "You don't have to tell me your story, but know this: speaking, it doesn't break you. It breaks the hold it has over you." I turned my face away, blinking hard. My throat ached with all the words I still couldn't say, but for the first time, hearing Eveline's steady admission, I felt something stir, a faint echo of possibility. If another woman found the strength to speak, why am I still hiding? The door banged open so suddenly that both Eveline and I flinched. Dahlia stormed into the room, her hair unbrushed, her coat half slipping from one shoulder. Her eyes locked on me with the same cold fire I had known for years. "You didn't answer my calls," she snapped. "What's going on? Where's the money?" Her voice carried across the ward, drawing curious glances from the nurses at the station. My cheeks burned, but my tongue stayed still. I could feel Eveline's gaze on me, steady and unblinking. "I had a heart attack," I whispered. My voice was hoarse, barely audible over the beeping machines. Dahlia waved it off like an inconvenience. "Fine, but you still got paid, didn't you? Don't play games with me, Mama. I need it now." The nurses approached one of them, a young man with kind eyes, saying gently, "Ma'am, you'll need to lower your voice. Patients here need rest." Dahlia turned her glare on him. "This is family business. Stay out of it." The humiliation was worse than the pain in my chest. My daughter shouting over me, strangers watching, pity blooming in their eyes. I wished the floor would open and swallow me whole. My hands trembled against the blanket, and I tried to fold them into stillness, but Dahlia's sharp gaze caught even that. "You're hiding something," she hissed, stepping closer to the bed. "Don't think I won't find out." I shrank back against the pillows, the air thick with her anger. My lips parted, but no sound came. It was Eveline, who reached across the gap between our beds and placed her hand over mine. Firm grounding. "Enough," Eveline said quietly, but her tone carried weight. Dahlia whipped her head around. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Eveline replied. "This is a hospital. If you can't treat your mother with respect, then you should leave." For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and electric. Dahlia's nostrils flared, her jaw tight. She looked from Eveline back to me, her eyes narrowing as though betrayed that another voice had joined the scene. "You've been talking about me," she accused. "Haven't you?" I shook my head quickly, fear and shame tangling in my throat. The older nurse arrived, then her expression firm. "Ma'am, you need to step outside. Now." Dahlia laughed bitterly, raising her hands in mock surrender. "Fine. But don't think this is over. You owe me, Mama. Don't forget that." Her words seared through me as she turned and stormed out the door, slamming behind her so hard the glass rattled. The ward slowly settled, but I could still feel the heat of all those eyes, nurses and patients alike. I wanted to disappear, to become invisible beneath the thin white sheet. Instead, I sat trembling, the shame clinging to me like sweat. Eveline's hand squeezed mine again, steady as stone. "Don't let her write your story for you," she murmured. My eyes stung. I turned my face away, unable to hold her gaze, afraid of what it reflected back at me. But her words lingered, pressing against the silence that had kept me caged for so long. Will this public scene finally force me to choose between shame and survival? The hospital released me 2 days later with a packet of instructions and a bottle of pills that rattled like small warnings in my purse. I felt fragile, but determined to do something ordinary, something that might remind me I still had control over my own life. So I stopped at the bank on the way home. The teller, a young woman with a bright smile, greeted me warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Rowan. What can I do for you today?" "I'd like to withdraw $200, I said. It was a modest sum, enough to cover groceries and the new prescription without dipping too far into the month's budget. She tapped at her keyboard, then frowned slightly. Her fingers moved again, slower this time. She excused herself, walked to a man in a suit behind the glass, and whispered something I couldn't hear. My stomach clenched. When she returned, her smile was gone. "Mrs. Rowan, could we step into the office for a moment?" I followed her to a small, glass-walled room where the man in the suit introduced himself as Mr. Kramer, the branch manager. He gestured for me to sit. "There seems to be an issue with your account," he began carefully. "As of Friday, nearly all of the funds were withdrawn." I blinked at him, convinced I had misheard. "That's not possible." "My pension deposit cleared last week." "It did," he said, sliding a printed statement across the desk. "But the balance now stands at $74 and change." The numbers blurred in front of my eyes. "Who took it?" I whispered. Mr. Kramer's voice softened. "The withdrawal was made under a power of attorney on file, granted to your daughter Dahlia Rowan." The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. A memory surfaced, years-old Dahlia standing in my kitchen with a pen in hand, assuring me it was just paperwork, in case you ever get sick, Mama, so I can help with bills. I had signed without reading closely, trusting her, believing it was for my protection. I closed my eyes. That paper had become a weapon. "Mr. Kramer," I said slowly, forcing my voice to remain steady, "does that document give her access only to my checking account?" He hesitated. "It would depend on the scope. If it was a general power of attorney, she could have authority over additional assets, including real property." Real property. My house. The modest apartment Walter and I had worked for all our lives. The only roof I had left, that was mine. My chest tightened, and for a moment I feared another collapse right there in that office. "Can it be revoked?" I managed. "Yes," he said quickly, as though sensing my panic. "You'd need to speak with an attorney to formally revoke it and notify all institutions. But for today, I'm afraid the funds are gone." I left the bank clutching the useless statement like proof of a crime. Outside, the sun was bright, but it felt harsh, glaring. Each step toward home grew heavier, as though I carried not just my body, but years of misplaced trust on my back. When I unlocked my apartment door, I didn't go inside right away. I stood there on the threshold, staring at the walls that had sheltered birthdays and Christmases, arguments and reconciliations, laughter and grief. Now all I could see was how easily they might be taken from me with the stroke of a pen. What happens when the roof over my head no longer belongs to me? The afternoon after the bank visit, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Elias holding a paper bag that smelled faintly of cinnamon. "Brought you some muffins," he said simply. I stepped aside to let him in, my voice catching. "You didn't have to." "I know," he replied, setting the bag on the counter. His eyes lingered on me, sharp as chisels. "You look worn down, Marcella. More than usual." The words loosened something inside me. Before I could stop myself, the confession slipped out. "I'm afraid of my own daughter." The silence that followed felt both terrifying and relieving. Elias didn't flinch, didn't look away. He only nodded as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "You shouldn't have to live that way," he said. "There are people who can help." Later that evening, Nora came by, holding a slim folder of papers. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her pen poised, her eyes steady. "There are steps we can take," she explained. "Revoking the power of attorney, documenting the financial abuse, even seeking protective orders if necessary. But it starts with you choosing to name what's happening." Her words felt heavy, each one pressing against the walls I had built around my silence. I traced the edge of the folder with my fingertip, the paper cool beneath my skin. "I don't know if I can," I whispered. "You don't have to decide tonight," Nora said. "But know this, you are not alone anymore." After she left, I sat for a long while at the table, the folder untouched in front of me as the daylight drained from the window. It was nearly midnight when Dahlia arrived. The door slammed open with the force of her hand, and she strode into the kitchen without a word of greeting. Violet trailed behind her, quiet as a shadow clutching a small stuffed rabbit to her chest. "Where's the money?" Dahlia demanded, her eyes scanning the table, as though the envelope might materialize if she glared hard enough. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I felt Violet's wide eyes on me, waiting. My throat was dry, my hands cold. "There is no money," I managed my voice, barely more than breath. Dahlia's head snapped toward me. "What do you mean, no money? Don't you lie to me, Mama." I swallowed, forcing the word out, though it trembled on my lips. "No." For a heartbeat, the room was frozen. Then Dahlia exploded, slamming her fist against the counter so hard the wooden rabbit in Violet's arms jumped. "You dare say no to me!" she shouted, her face flushed with rage. Violet whimpered and pressed closer to the wall. I felt myself shrinking back, fear surging like an old tide, but the word had already been spoken. "No." I whispered again, softer but real. Dahlia's eyes narrowed, fury burning in them. But in that same instant, I caught the reflection of Violet's face, confusion, fear, and something else I couldn't name. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. Dahlia turned away, muttering under her breath, and stormed toward the door. Violet lingered a moment longer, her eyes fixed on me, then followed quickly after her mother. The door slammed, leaving me alone in the quivering quiet. My chest ached, but this time, it wasn't only from fear. Something had cracked open, something I couldn't take back. If my own granddaughter now sees the truth, will she remember me as brave or broken? The next morning, Nora returned. She carried no flowers, no food, only a small notebook with a plain brown cover and a pen clipped neatly to its side. She placed it on my table like an offering. "This," she said, "is where it begins." I looked at it as if it were something fragile, dangerous even. "A notebook documentation," she explained. "Write down every time she calls, every threat she makes, every bruise you notice. Dates, times, details. It may feel small, but it builds a record. And that record can protect you." I touched the cover with my fingertips, hesitant. The cardboard felt thin, hardly capable of shielding me from someone like Dahlia. "What if she finds it?" I asked. "Hide it well," Nora said gently, "but don't let fear stop you from writing. Your words matter, Marcella. They can become proof." After she left, I sat for hours staring at the notebook, the pen resting beside it. The air in the apartment seemed heavier than usual, pressing me down. My chest still ached faintly from the attack, but this ache was different. It was the weight of decision. At last, I opened to the first page. My handwriting shook as I wrote the date at the top. March 12th, 9th, 17 p.m. Dahlia called, demanded money, said, "I'll come for the money tonight. Don't you dare go out." I paused, staring at the crooked letters. Was this really enough to capture the truth? Could the sharpness of her voice, the fear it stabbed into me, live on in ink and paper? I turned the page and kept writing. March 14th, 11:52 p.m. She entered the apartment without knocking. Violet with her. Slammed fist on counter when I said no. The words bled across the page, shaky but steady enough to read. My hand cramped, but I continued sketching details I had tried so hard to forget: the bruises, the slammed doors, the stolen envelopes. When I stopped, I realized my cheeks were wet. I hadn't noticed the tears falling. It felt like betrayal setting down her name in this way. She was my daughter, the child I had carried, the girl who once left love notes in crayon under my pillow. Guilt twisted in my chest. A voice inside whispered, "You're ruining her. You're condemning your own flesh and blood." But another voice, quieter, older, rose against it. "No, she has condemned herself. You are only telling the truth." I pressed the pen harder against the page. The ink blotched where my hand trembled. But still I wrote. Each word felt like a nail hammered into a fragile shield, something flimsy yet necessary to stand between me and her. I set the pen down at last, staring at the pages filled with my handwriting. Proof, Nora had called it. To me it looked like a confession, not of guilt, but of survival. That night, I tucked the notebook deep inside an old recipe box, sliding it behind yellowed cards for stews and pies I no longer cooked. I placed the box on the top shelf of the pantry, hidden, but close enough to reach. As I closed the door, I felt both exposed and fortified. My silence had been my prison, but now my words, fragile, imperfect, were stepping into its place. When justice needs proof, will my words on paper be strong enough to stand? The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and paper, as if the walls themselves had absorbed years of whispered pleas and shouted denials. I sat on the hard wooden bench, my hands clenched around the thin folder in my lap. Inside were the pages Nora had helped me prepare, my shaky notes, copied neatly, dates lined in ink proof of what I had endured. 2 pages. That was all I had. 2 fragile sheets of paper against years of silence. When my case was called, I rose slowly, my legs stiff, my chest tight with nerves. Dahlia was already at the table, her hair smoothed, her lipstick sharp, her smile a blade. She didn't look at me, not once. The judge entered, robes flowing, his presence commanding the room without a single raised word. Judge Rivera, a name Nora had spoken with respect. He glanced first at Dahlia, then at me, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Rowan, he said, his voice deep but steady. I understand you have submitted a document regarding alleged financial exploitation. Would you please provide it? My hands trembled as I stepped forward, placing the 2 pages onto the clerk's desk. The sound of paper sliding across wood seemed louder than it should have been. I returned to my seat, my heart pounding so hard I feared the entire courtroom could hear it. Dahlia gave a little laugh, just loud enough for those around her to notice. This is ridiculous, she said. She's 70, for God's sake. Senile. She forgets where she puts her own glasses, and then blames me. The words sliced through me, but I kept my eyes on the judge. For once, I would not meet her stare. Judge Rivera leaned forward, reading the pages with deliberate care, his brow furrowed slightly. Mrs. Rowan has listed multiple withdrawals from her account under a power of attorney, including dates and amounts. She also documents verbal threats and forced entries. He looked up, his eyes narrowing on Dahlia. Ms. Rowan, how do you respond to these allegations? Dahlia flicked her hair back, feigning boredom. She exaggerates everything. I've been helping her with her finances because she can't manage them herself. That power of attorney, she signed it willingly. She wanted me to handle things. Judge Rivera didn't blink. And yet the account balance is nearly depleted within weeks of pension deposits. How do you explain that she spends more than she admits? Dahlia shot back. She's not telling you the truth. I felt my throat tighten, but I forced the words out. $200 a month. That's what I ask for to cover food, medicine, and utilities. The rest she takes. My voice wavered, but I pressed on. I never agreed for her to empty everything. Never. The courtroom was silent, except for the scratching of the clerk's pen. Judge Rivera leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Rowan's testimony is supported by her notes. While brief, they are consistent and specific. This court takes such matters seriously. I am ordering a full financial investigation into all accounts and assets under the power of attorney. My breath caught. It was more than I had hoped for, more than I had dared to imagine. Dahlia's face twisted, her mouth opening as if to protest, but no words came. For the first time in years, I saw her caught off guard. This hearing will reconvene once the investigation is complete, Judge Rivera concluded. Until then, Ms. Rowan, you are prohibited from making further withdrawals under the existing power of attorney. The gavel struck sharp and final. As people began to shuffle from the room, Dahlia finally turned her gaze on me. Her smile was gone, replaced with something harder, colder, a promise of retaliation. What will Dahlia do when the system she always ignored finally looks her way? It was Elias who told me first. He came by that evening, his face pale in the fading light. He didn't even remove his cap as he stepped inside, his hand gripping the doorframe as though steadying himself. I didn't mean to overhear, he began, his voice low. But I was walking through the parking lot after picking up some groceries. He paused, his eyes searching mine. I saw Dahlia there. She wasn't alone. My stomach nodded. Who was she with a man? Elias said, broad-shouldered, rough-looking. He had her backed up against the hood of a car. I heard him say, "You're late again. You think excuses keep me fed?" And he shook his head slowly. She begged him, said, "I'll get you the money, I swear." The room tilted slightly. I gripped the counter to steady myself. Loan sharks. I whispered the word, tasting like rust in my mouth. Elias nodded grimly. It looked that way. The shame pressed down heavier than the fear. My daughter, my blood reduced to pleading in a parking lot, selling off pieces of my life to feed debts I didn't even know existed. When Nora visited the next morning, I told her what Elias had seen. She didn't look surprised, only weary, as though she had heard the story too many times from too many mouths. "This complicates things," she said, carefully placing her folder on the table. "When someone owes money to dangerous people, their desperation grows. It can make them reckless, even violent." I stared at the teacup cooling in my hands. "She already is." "Yes," Nora admitted. "But now the stakes are higher. She's not only after your pension out of greed or entitlement. She may feel cornered. And a cornered person will do almost anything." Her words hollowed me out. I thought of Dahlia as a child again, her hair tangled after running through the yard, her voice high with laughter as she called for me to watch her skip. That girl seemed farther away than ever, buried under years of lies and debts and rage. I set the cup down carefully, afraid my hands would drop it. "What can I do?" "You've already begun," Nora said. "Your testimony is in motion and the court will investigate. But you need to be cautious. Keep records, stay surrounded when possible. And if she comes to your door again, don't be alone." Her eyes locked on mine. "Promise me." I nodded, though the promise felt flimsy in my mouth. Dahlia didn't respect walls or doors or promises. She took what she wanted and left splinters behind. After Nora left, I sat in the quiet, the shadows stretching across the floor as the day dimmed. I thought of Elias's voice, low and troubled, repeating Dahlia's words in that parking lot. "I'll get you the money, I swear." For years, I had told myself her demands were about control, about punishing me for every imagined wrong. Now I understood something darker. She was feeding not only her greed, but someone else's hunger. The thought chilled me, because when greed was the master, perhaps there were limits. But when desperation took the reins, I wasn't sure there were any left. If desperation fuels her rage, how far will my daughter go to squeeze me dry? The night was quiet, at first so quiet that I thought maybe I would finally get some sleep. I had just settled into my chair by the window when the door burst open with a crash that rattled the frame. Dahlia stormed inside, her footsteps pounding across the floor like thunder. "You'll regret this," she spat, her voice sharp enough to slice through the air. Violet trailed behind her, clutching that same stuffed rabbit. But she darted behind the sofa as soon as the shouting began. I caught a glimpse of her wide, frightened eyes peeking from the cushions, her little body trembling. Dahlia paced the room, her hands clenched into fists. "You think a judge can stop me? You think some paper will change what you owe me?" She slammed her palm against the table so hard the salt shaker tipped and rolled to the floor. My heart hammered, but I stayed in my chair, clutching the armrests as if they might hold me steady. "It isn't yours," I said softly. The words felt fragile, but they were all I had. She laughed, bitter and sharp. "Everything you have is mine." You'd be nothing without me. Don't you forget it." The walls seemed to shake with her fury. Each word bounced through the apartment, filling every corner with heat and venom. I thought of Violet, crouched in fear, absorbing it all. Across the hall, Elias must have heard the commotion. I saw the faint outline of his shadow at my window, moving back and forth, then disappearing. Minutes later, my phone buzzed silently where it sat on the counter. I knew it was him. He would be calling Nora just as he promised he would if things grew dangerous. Dahlia's voice rose again. "I know you've been talking to people. That social worker, that neighbor. Do you think I don't see? You're trying to turn everyone against me?" I pressed my lips together, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of a reply. My silence only enraged her further. She grabbed the vase from the side table and hurled it against the wall. It shattered into pieces, shards scattering across the floor. Violet let out a small whimper from behind the sofa, muffled but unmistakable. Dahlia spun toward the sound. For a moment, her face softened at the sight of her daughter cowering there, but it hardened again as quickly as it had cracked. "You see what you're doing, Mama. Even she's afraid now. And that's on you." The cruelty of it stole my breath. I wanted to reach for Violet to shield her, but I dared not move while Dahlia's fury stormed unchecked. Then came the knock on the door, firm, controlled. Dahlia froze her chest, heaving, her eyes darting toward the sound. Another knock followed, louder this time. "Ms. Rowan," a calm voice called through the wood. "It's Nora Delacroix. May I come in?" Dahlia's face twisted, fury and fear warring inside her. She glared at me, then at the door, then back again. For a long moment, I thought she might lash out once more. Instead, she stormed past me, yanked the door open, and shoved past Nora without a word, her coat trailing behind her like smoke. The apartment was silent again, but the silence was jagged, full of broken glass and trembling breaths. Violet crept out from behind the sofa. Her rabbit clutched tight, her eyes searching mine. I reached for her hand, and when her small fingers curled around mine, I felt the weight of every wall in this home pressing down on us. When the walls of my home shake with her fury, can I still claim it as mine? The morning after Dahlia's storm passed, Nora returned, this time not alone. 2 uniformed officers followed her into my apartment, their boots heavy on the floorboards. A third man came in last, dressed in a suit with a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Mr. Keller, clerk for Judge Rivera. His tone was courteous, but clipped the way men speak when every word matters. They surveyed my living room as though it were a stage. One of the officers unzipped a black bag and produced a small camera, no larger than my thumb. He fixed it discreetly above the bookshelf, angling it toward the kitchen table. Another placed one near the lamp, its lens hidden beneath the shade. "We need clear footage of her taking the money or making threats," Nora explained gently, standing close so I wouldn't feel adrift in the tide of strangers. "This will make your testimony undeniable." On the table, they laid an envelope thick with decoy bills. The sight of it made my stomach twist. For years, that envelope had been a symbol of surrender, something I placed like an offering before my daughter's anger. Now it was bait. I pressed a trembling hand against my chest. "If anything happens," I said, my voice breaking, "protect my granddaughter. Don't let Violet get caught in the middle." Nora touched my arm. "We will. I promise." The officers walked me through the plan. When Dahlia came, I was to remain calm, seated at the table. They would be nearby, listening through tiny microphones, now hidden in the corners. I would not be alone, even if it felt that way. Still, the thought of it made my body shake. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to lock the door, to hide. But running had never saved me. Silence had never saved me. Only truth might. Mr. Keller opened his briefcase and withdrew a stack of forms. "Judge Rivera has authorized this operation under protective order." We'll document everything. Mrs. Rowan, you must understand, this evidence could determine not only financial restitution, but also criminal charges. His words blurred for a moment as I stared at the papers. Criminal charges. Against my daughter. My own flesh and blood. I closed my eyes, grief washing over me. Elias arrived, then summoned by Nora for support. He stood by the window, arms folded, his presence solid as oak. You're not doing this alone, he said simply. That night after they all left, I sat alone in the staged room. The envelope glared at me from the table, daring me to look away. The cameras were invisible to the eye, but I felt their gaze all the same. I thought of Violet's frightened eyes, peeking from behind the sofa of her small hand in mine. She deserved more than shadows and broken glass. She deserved a grandmother who did not cower. The clock ticked on each second, dragging me closer to the moment of reckoning. I folded my hands together, whispering into the quiet, "Please let this be enough." When the officers returned the following day to finalize the setup, one of them tested the microphone hidden in the lamp. My own voice echoed faintly from the receiver he carried. The sound startled me. I had spent so many years trying not to be heard. Nora looked at me, then her eyes steady, her voice soft but firm. Courage doesn't mean the fear is gone, Marcella. It means you act anyway. I nodded, though my chest felt like glass about to shatter. The plan was set, the table prepared, the envelope waiting. Will the trap hold, or will I lose everything in one reckless gamble? The knock came at dusk, 2 hard raps, then the scrape of the lock turning. I gripped the armrests of my chair as the door swung open. Dahlia entered first, her movements sharp and frantic. But she wasn't alone. A man followed close behind, taller than her, broad-shouldered. His face shadowed with menace. His hand clamped onto her arm as though he owned it. "I told you I'd get it," Dahlia muttered to him. Then her eyes flicked toward me. "Mama, where is it?" "Don't play games." Her voice was ragged, different from before, no longer only demanding but desperate. I forced myself to stay seated at the table. The envelope lay in plain sight, exactly as planned. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear. The man's gaze followed hers to the envelope. That it. His voice was gravel, low and dangerous. But before Dahlia could answer, movement stirred from the corners of the room. 2 officers stepped forward from behind the kitchen doorway, their badges glinting. Mr. Keller appeared at the threshold with a clipboard. Nora stood close behind her arms, folded, her eyes locked on Dahlia. The air froze. Dahlia's face drained of color. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "This," Mr. Keller said evenly, "is evidence gathering under court authority. You've been exploiting your mother's finances, and now we see you've brought someone else into it." The man released her arm, his posture stiffening as he noticed the uniforms. His glare swung toward Dahlia. "You set me up." "No," Dahlia's voice cracked. I didn't know, but the panic in her eyes betrayed her. She took a step backward, her hands fluttering as though she might claw the air itself. "This isn't what it looks like. Mama, tell them. Tell them you gave me permission." I pressed my palms together in my lap. My voice came out steady, though my body shook. "I gave you trust. You turned it into chains." Her lips parted, but no words came. The silence around us deepened, heavy as stone. The creditor swore under his breath and lunged toward the door, but the officers blocked his path. One held him firmly by the arm, while the other pulled out a pair of cuffs. Metal clicked. "Wait," Dahlia cried, her voice breaking. She looked at the envelope on the table, then at me, her eyes wild. "Mama, please. You don't know what they'll do to me if I can't pay." It struck me then, this wasn't only about taking from me. She was trapped in her own spiral debts piled high, fear eating her from the inside. But pity didn't erase the truth. She had made me her prey instead of her refuge. The officers turned to her next. She lifted her chin for a moment, her jaw tight, but when they reached for her wrist, the strength drained from her. Her face, pale and hollow, looked nothing like the girl I once held close. Violet's small voice echoed in my memory, trembling behind the sofa. "Grandma, don't let her hurt you." I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them. "Protect my granddaughter," I said. "That's all I ask." Nora's hand touched my shoulder gently. "We will." Dahlia's knees buckled, and for a second I thought she might collapse. But then she jerked free, her eyes flashing, and the cornered fury returned. When cornered, will my daughter crumble? Or will she fight like a cornered wolf? The moment the officers moved toward Dahlia, the fury broke loose. "You can't do this to me!" she shrieked, her voice splintering through the room. She lunged toward the table, snatching up the vase of carnations Elias had brought me the week before. With a wild swing, she hurled it against the wall. It exploded into shards, water streaking down the paint like tears. Mr. Keller flinched back, shielding his briefcase, but the officers advanced steadily. Dahlia's chest heaved, her hair falling into her face, her eyes blazing like a cornered animal. In that chaos, the door opened, and Marina stepped inside. My younger daughter, whom I had barely begun to rebuild bridges with, froze at the sight, her sister raging, the police ready, and me trembling in my chair. "Dahlia," Marina said firmly, her voice louder than I had ever heard it. "Stop!" But Dahlia spun and shoved her hard in the shoulder. Marina stumbled back against the doorframe with a cry. "Stay out of this. You always wanted to ruin me," Dahlia shouted, spittle flying, hands shaking. The room tilted in my vision. For a moment, I saw them both as little girls, hair tangled from playing in the yard, their voices shrill, not with hatred, but with childhood squabbles. And then that vision shattered, leaving only this twisted, furious woman before me. I felt a tug at my side. Violet had slipped from the hallway, running toward me, clutching her stuffed rabbit tight against her chest. She buried her face in my lap, her small body trembling. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice breaking, "don't let her hurt you." Something inside me snapped, then not in fear, but in resolve. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close, my trembling hands finally steady. "Enough," I said, louder than I thought possible. The word cracked across the room, not with rage, but with finality. The officers moved swiftly. One grabbed Dahlia's arm, twisting it behind her back. She thrashed, screaming, "She's lying! She's poisoned you all against me! You don't know what she's done." The other officer steadied Marina, guiding her away from the door while keeping his eyes locked on Dahlia. In the corner, the creditor cursed, trying to edge toward the exit, but he was caught too, pulled down with a grunt, metal cuffs snapping around his wrists. The sound of chains on flesh, of cuffs locking shut, filled the silence that followed Dahlia's screams. My chest heaved, but I clung to Violet tighter, her little arms wrapped around my neck as if anchoring me in place. Dahlia fought until the last, her eyes wild, her face red, her breath ragged. But when the officers dragged her toward the door, something in her finally cracked. The fury drained, leaving her face pale, hollow. For a second, I thought I glimpsed the girl she once was hiding behind the broken mask of who she had become. Marina moved toward me, then touching my shoulder gently. "Are you all right, Mama?" I nodded, though my voice was gone. My gaze followed the officers, leading Dahlia out, her body stiff against their grip. The creditor followed, cursing under his breath as they shoved him through the door. The apartment was left in ruins, glass shards on the floor, water dripping down the wall, the smell of fear still clinging to the air. But in my arms, Violet's small body was warm, alive, safe. If blood can turn so cruel, can respect ever return to my table? Weeks passed before the apartment stopped sounding like her. Every creak of the floorboards, every slam of a car door outside had carried her shadow. But slowly, the silence softened. It no longer felt like waiting for the next storm, but like air finally returning after being held too long. When Nora suggested I join the community supper at the parish hall, I hesitated. I hadn't shared a table with more than one person at a time in years. But she insisted. And so, one Saturday evening, Elias walked with me, his steady stride easing my nerves. The hall was modest folding chairs, long tables covered with checkered cloths, the smell of roasted chicken and baked bread drifting through the air. Children ran between the rows, laughter bouncing off the walls. For the first time in a long while, the sound didn't pierce me. It warmed me. Nora waved from across the room. Marina was beside her, setting down a basket of cornbread, her hair tied back her face brighter than I had seen in years. And Violet. Sweet Violet was arranging paper napkins carefully at each place, setting her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm like an honored guest. When I reached the table, Marina pulled me into a gentle embrace. "I saved you a seat, Mama." Elias sat on one side of me, Nora on the other. Around us, neighbors gathered Mr. Ortega, who always fixed his fence, but never stopped it from leaning. Mrs. Callahan, who brought her famous peach cobbler. Each person carried a dish not expensive or fancy, but full of care. We ate together, the clatter of cutlery mixing with laughter. Elias told stories from his days as a carpenter, how he once built a staircase that spiraled too tight, forcing him to climb sideways. Nora teased him. Her laughter, light her eyes shining in a way that made her seem far younger. I found myself smiling, not because I forced it, but because it came. Violet leaned across the table, her cheeks smudged with crumbs. "Grandma, did you know rabbits can have 13 babies at once?" I chuckled, shaking my head. 13, I could barely manage 2 daughters. Marina laughed softly, but her eyes flickered with something unspoken sorrow, maybe, or memory. I reached across the table and took her hand. She squeezed back, no words needed. At one point, I looked around the room at the mismatched plates and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead, and I felt something settle inside me. It wasn't grandeur or luxury. It wasn't the weight of money counted or taken. It was peace. For so long, my table had been a place of fear, where silence sat heavier than food, where I bent under the demands of one voice. But here, at this simple hall, I realized peace was not measured by the size of the table or the richness of the meal. It was measured by who sat with you, those who chose to bring warmth instead of fear, laughter instead of threats. I caught Elias watching me quietly, his eyes soft. Nora noticed too, and she leaned close. "This is how it should be," she said. Yes, I whispered more to myself than anyone else. This is how it should be. The evening wore on. Plates emptied, stories stretched long, children grew sleepy in their parents' arms. When the last of the peach cobbler was gone, Marina began gathering the dishes. Violet climbed into my lap, her small body heavy with drowsiness. She nestled against me, murmuring, "Grandma, this feels nice." I kissed the top of her head. "It does, my love. It really does." As I held her, I thought of the shattered vase, the broken glass glinting on my floor, Dahlia's voice screaming that I owed her everything. And then I looked at the child sleeping in my arms, the family around me, the neighbors who treated me as equal, and I knew the truth. What remains once fear has been pushed out the door? Morning came gently, with a pale light spilling over the Savannah River and into my apartment. The window caught it, softening the glow as it filtered through the glass jars lined neatly along the sill. Inside each jar, a rose cutting had taken root. Some were still tender, their stems fragile, their leaves shy. Others had already bloomed red and pink heads, lifting toward the sun as if they had always known where to turn. I watered them carefully, as I did each morning, tipping the pitcher just enough to refresh the soil without drowning it. My hands still shook sometimes, but now it was from age, not fear. The difference mattered. Behind me, the kitchen carried the scent of cinnamon and apples. A pie cooled on the counter, steam curling upward in thin ribbons. I cut the first slice, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I placed it on a plate for myself. Not for Dahlia, not as an offering or a shield. For me. I carried it to the table where Violet sat with her paints spread across old newspapers. She had already dipped her brush into a jar of water, swirling it until the surface shimmered like liquid glass. Her tongue poked out in concentration as she filled a page with bright, bold strokes. "Is it a rose?" I asked, smiling at the red circle forming under her hand. "It's you, Grandma," she said matter-of-factly, without looking up. "You're the rose. You keep growing even when people try to step on you." My throat tightened, but I forced the pie into my mouth, the sweetness and spice grounding me. "That's a strong rose," then I managed. Across the room, Marina sat curled in my armchair with a book open on her lap. She had been coming by more often, bringing groceries, laughter, and pieces of her life that I thought I had lost forever. Now her presence felt natural again, like sunlight through the window. Something that had been missing so long I forgot how much I needed it. "What are you reading?" I asked. "Wolf," she replied without looking up. "Eveline lent it to me." She smiled faintly, and I thought of my hospital roommate, her steady voice naming what I had been too afraid to say. My son pushed me once enough to end trust forever. Eveline had planted a seed in me the way these roses had been planted, a reminder that life could bloom again, even after being cut down. I glanced back at the window, at the jars catching the morning light. My reflection wavered faintly in the glass. The lines on my face deepened my hair more white than gray. Yet in my eyes, for the first time in years, there was no shadow. I had once believed love alone could hold a family together. I had told myself that giving, yielding, sacrificing would mend the cracks. But love unguarded had left me bare. It had opened doors that should have stayed locked, given access to hands that did not know gentleness. Now I understood. Love may open doors, but only respect keeps them open. Without respect, love becomes a chain. With it, love becomes a home. Violet lifted her painting proudly, smudging red across her fingers. Marina looked up from her book, smiling at the sight. I laughed softly, the sound startling me by how free it felt. The roses by the window swayed slightly in the morning breeze, their roots deepening in clear water, their petals wide and unafraid. I set down my fork, leaned back in my chair, and let the warmth of the room settle into me. For the first time in many years, I was not waiting for a knock at the door, not bracing for a voice raised in anger. I was simply here, in the light, in the quiet, with roses and paint, and pages turning. And that was enough.